slowed up the process just a little bit, but I have a prepared statement, and then I have, I'll take some questions at the end of the prepared statement, so just bear with me. If you can just hold the questions, so I'll finish with the prepared statement, I'd appreciate it. On June 20th, 2012, at approximately 15:11 hours, troopers from the Vermont State Police Bradford Barracks were contacted by an intake crisis technician at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center regarding a person that was reportedly suicidal. The person called the hospital threatening to harm and kill himself and others. It was also reported that the person had weapons and prepared to use them. The person was identified as 39-year-old Macadam Mason. 3 troopers from the Bradford Barracks initially responded to a residence located at 1100 Sawney Bean Road in the town of Thetford. The troopers saw Mr. Mason inside the residence through a window and knocked on the door and asked him to come out to speak with them. Mr. Mason was uncooperative and refused to comply with the troopers' request to speak with him. The troopers remained at the residence and called a family member of Mr. Mason, asking if the family member could respond to the area to provide the troopers with a recent history of Mr. Mason that could aid in de-escalating Mr. Mason. When Mr. Mason's family member arrived, Mr. Mason ran from the residence into a wooded area behind the residence. Troopers called for medical personnel to come to the area to be available to assist if their assistance was needed. The Vermont State Police K-9 was also called in to assist with the search of Mr. Mason. A couple of hours later, Mr. Mason returned to his residence and was addressed by a trooper. Several verbal commands were directed at him, which he refused to comply with. The trooper noticed that Mr. Mason was unarmed, therefore he lowered his weapon and drew his taser. The trooper ordered Mr. Mason on the ground, and Mr. Mason lowered to a squatting position. The trooper continued to tell Mr. Mason to get on his stomach, at which time Mr. Mason stood up and moved toward the trooper with a closed fist, yelling aggressively at the trooper. Mr. Mason and the trooper were now less than 10 feet from one another. The trooper continued with verbal commands for Mr. Mason to get on the ground. And after several failed attempts for Mr. Mason to comply, the trooper deployed his taser, striking Mr. Mason in the chest. Mr. Mason went to the ground, and the trooper immediately rendered first aid as he observed Mr. Mason was unresponsive. The trooper administered CPR and continued to do so until rescue personnel took over the care of Mr. Mason. Transported him via ambulance to the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire, where he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Several Vermont State Police investigators from outside the area were contacted to conduct the investigation. The completed investigation will be forwarded to the Orange County State's Attorney's Office and the Attorney General. The name of the trooper involved in the incident is being withheld for a 24-hour period per policy of the Vermont State Police. The autopsy is scheduled for 1 p.m. today at the office of the Chief Medical Examiner's Office in Concord, New Hampshire. Results of the autopsy information are not under the jurisdiction of the state of Vermont, as that portion of the investigation will be directed to the New Hampshire Medical Examiner's Office. Can I answer any questions?
Is it standard protocol to tase someone in the chest, or what's protocol for tasing someone?
The protocol is to acquire the target and deploy the taser. And at this last night's incident, that's where the taser landed.
Is there a brand or model of the taser that was used?
It's the standard model that we have purchased for all of our troopers, and the actual model number, do you know?
I don't have the model number, but I can get that for you.
Sir, do you know if this is the first time that a person has died from a taser in Vermont, or from state police use of a taser in Vermont?
The person passed away. It's still under investigation as the cause of death. So to say that the person died from a taser, it's early in the investigation. We have to wait for the autopsy to come back. So
Following a taser incident, do you know if this is the first time?
I can only speak to the state police. I haven't looked into the other agencies.
Could you give us
How
a little?
about the state police? Is this the first time?
The first time for what?
That someone's died so close after the use of the taser?
Yes.
Could you give us a little bit of a background on the force's acquisition and use of tasers? It's fairly new that they're issued. Who gets them? Just How many are out in the streets, that kind of thing?
We have right now 207 tasers in the field. That includes all uniformed members from the rank of lieutenant to the newest trooper coming out of the academy. There is an initial training process that takes place, and there's a recertification process that takes place. Currently, there are 3 troopers that have not received the latest recertification process, and the trooper that was involved in last night's incident is not one of the 3. In the latest training that we do have a mental health component that is 2 hours out of the 8 hours that we're working with mental health officials during that training process.
Did the trooper involved in this incident tell you that Mr. Mason, did he appear to be intoxicated or high or anything like that?
Well, he was certainly agitated, failed to comply with the trooper's commands, and the troopers was fearful of bodily injury at the time. We were not sure if, in fact, Mr. Mason had weapons up until the time the trooper actually had a visual on him coming from the woods. Again, as I stated, the trooper did have his patrol rifle with him, and when he noticed that Mr. Mason was unarmed, that he had no weapon, the trooper lowered his weapon and transitioned to the taser.
So when we're talking about lowering his weapon and the firearm that he had, we're talking about a patrol rifle, not a handgun?
That's correct.
These stun guns have historically been referred to as non-lethal. That being said, how do you hope the public receives this information, knowing that there are 207 tasers out on the streets used by Vermont State Police?
Right. That's exactly why we have to conduct a thorough investigation, because there's certainly a level of public trust and understanding when it comes to these devices or these tools. And we need to understand exactly what took place leading up to the deployment, what took place after the deployment, what was the cause of death, and I assure you we're going to look into that. Again, here it is. It's 11:30 in the morning. We're not at we haven't conducted the autopsy yet, and we're just at the beginning stages of this investigation. But I appreciate your question, Jack. To get this information out to the public immediately is our goal.
Do you think, going off of that, I know in October the regulations were kind of changed because of mental health patients. Will, depending on the autopsy, will you be also looking at your policies and procedures you have in place now for when you use a taser?
Good question. You know, like every policy that we have, we always review. They're living documents. We have to review the policies, and we will review the policy and how it pertains to the incident and the actions that took place last night. So to give you an answer right now, will there be changes? I don't know that yet. We need to really take a good thorough look at the events that took place last night before we can make that decision.
Do you know if it was a 5-second, I think 5 seconds is standard. Was it 5 seconds that was deployed from his
Yes,
gun?
it was.
Was it just, was he just tased once?
Once.
Was there any prior medical history that you're aware of with Mr. Mason?
We're starting to pick up some information in the investigation, but I'm not prepared to talk about that at this point, because it has to be vetted to ensure that it took place in respect to his family and other members of his loved ones and things like that. I don't want to get on that road.
Is there a particular place in the body you should tase or not tase?
There's
Is there
places that you should not tase, and the face and things like that. In a situation like how it developed, where the taser was deployed, where it was struck, is in compliance with the policy. But again, we're still going to look at the entire episode and how it unfolded.
So the trooper, was he the rank of trooper?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I think to make it easier, we're going to give you the information tonight. We're going to put it out in the form of a press release, who the trooper is, how long he's been on, and things like that.
Okay, and do you know what time to put that out?
I would hope by about 6 o'clock tonight.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit earlier. I understand the deadlines that you have too, but the reason that policy took place because one of our troopers was involved in a situation where someone lost their life. There were numerous threats placed upon the trooper and the trooper's family, so we changed our policy a couple of years ago to ensure that the safety of those involved isn't jeopardized.
And when were those 207 tasers deployed among your force?
2011, I think it was April of 2011 is when they were deployed out. We had tasers that were issued to our tactical team. Before that, the entire state police uniform division were issued tasers in April of 2011.
And so what was he trying to take him into custody for? Was it a protective custody situation?
Exactly. Take him into protective custody, get him to the hands of mental health officials that could evaluate and work with the crisis that he was currently in. Again, the call came from a mental health clinician to the state police, so they were already engaged at the outset. We contacted an ambulance service to be in the area in anticipation of this. In fact, the welfare check escalated to where it escalated to. So in that respect, we did all the things that we could leading up to meeting with Mr. Mason.
With somebody in crisis like that, do the state police ever think that perhaps somebody in uniform with a weapon is not the way to deal with it, and maybe having the mental health intervener approach rather than the officer could de-escalate?
Well, every situation is different, and this call came in that this gentleman was going to harm himself and harm others, and to think that we would send a trooper in without protection is unrealistic. But I appreciate the question, because certainly there's ways to de-escalate crisis, and we go through a process to try to de-escalate a crisis. But at the same time, you have to appreciate and respect the job that's being done out there by the men and women of law enforcement, that they're placed in these positions. We chose to be in this position, and we're placed in those positions. When the call comes in, we're going to answer the call, yet at the same time we need to protect ourselves. So, and the trooper in this instance clearly lowered his patrol rifle and recognizing that no weapon was involved, yet still fearful of what Mr. Mason, who's 6 feet, 190, 195, coming at him within 10 feet, fearful of what could take place.
Do you think the use of the taser was justified, in line with state police policy in this case?
As I said, the investigation is still unfolding. I'm going to look at that, and look at the events that took place, and we'll look at the policy, and we'll see how things line up. Again, and the other piece that has to be mentioned again is the investigation is in fact turned over to the state's attorney's office and turned over to the attorney general's office. They'll form their opinions as to what happens next.
Do you have a record of how many times these devices have been deployed in the field, with any result?
Yeah, we deployed them 32 times in 2011. 32? 32 times. 49 times there were just displays, meaning the trooper took the taser out of his holster, or her holster, and the situation was de-escalated just by the mere fact that it was shown. To date, we have had 16 active deployments, so we're right in line where we were last year at this time with actual deployments. However, we're down to 13 displays up until today's date, which is much less than last year.
Is New Hampshire involved in any way? You mentioned the New Hampshire State Medical Examiner's Office, so are they involved in the investigation?
Not involved in the investigation. However, Mr. Mason has been transported. When he was transported to Dartmouth-Hitchcock, they obviously take over jurisdiction, so they'll conduct the autopsy. The results will be funneled through their office, so we don't have necessarily the jurisdiction that we would have. We have a relationship with them, but not the same as we do with our OCME here in Vermont.
Can
You
you
called in with the the report of someone threatening himself and others.
Who called in?
Yeah.
Well, I told you at the very beginning, but I'll give you the press release so you get that answer.
I can't remember what I was just going to ask. So after Mr. Mason was tased, did he lose consciousness? What happened right after he was tased?
The trooper noticed that Mr. Mason was in distress and immediately began to perform CPR, and then the rescue personnel arrived and took him from the scene.
He stopped breathing.
Right, exactly.
That's probably not typical though, correct?
Correct.
Can you talk about because I don't really know, but medically, what does a taser do? I know you guys get a lot of training. Does it accelerate your heart rate? What happens when you get shocked or hit with one of these things?
Well, do you want to?
Captain,
We have a captain here that
it's a little bit more dialed
It's a
in
little-
the actual effects of the device itself and the training component. Want to just speak to that?
Yeah,
Ken?
but it's just this weird.
The results of it, it overrides the nervous system, so
Can you
it
speak over there?
overrides the nervous system, so it immediately stops whatever activity is taking place in the body. So that if the person is being aggressive, that 5-second pulse, and during that 5-second pulse of electricity, it stops that person from doing whatever activity was taking place when the decision was made to deploy the taser. The exact medical effects of that, I don't have that. I just know that, again, during a 5-second deployment of the electricity, that it overrides the nervous system and disables the person from doing aggressive activity.
Thank you.
Was the trooper who deployed the taser the only law enforcement officer on scene at the time?
No, there were other troopers there as well.
Could you say how many troopers were on scene, and was there like a roadblock or anything going on?
There were 3 troopers from the Bradford Barracks, along with a BCI detective that had arrived, along with the other troopers. So I believe there were 4 uniformed troopers there and a BCI detective on at the residence, in and around the residence at the time.
At the time of the deployment of the
Correct.
taser.
And how far away was the ambulance?
The ambulance was deployed within a staging area. I don't have the exact distance from the residence.
But nearby.
Yes.
Does Mr. Mason have a prior criminal record?
He does have a prior criminal record, and it dates back years, but there is some history of domestic violence against women, simple assaults, and other crimes that he was investigated and arrested for.
Did Mr. Mason live alone?
He did not.
Was there anyone else home at the time that this was going on?
No.
Who did he live with?
Well, I shouldn't say, there were other people. When you say home, inside the residence, there were family members in the area.
Inside the building?
No, outside the residence where this took place.
So family members were around.
Yeah.
Does he have kids?
Not that I'm aware of. Couple more questions and then we're gonna get back.
What's the standard protocol for when a trooper can deploy a taser? What requirements do you met before they?
Well, there has to be a level of threat that the trooper's confronting, and there's a level of force that can be employed too. Obviously, in this particular instance, the level of force did not rise to the level of deadly force, where he lowered his patrol rifle. There was still the element of fear coming from the trooper that there would be bodily harm, either to himself or to Mr. Mason, and to quell that. At that point, that's when he deployed the taser.
What is, okay.
Were any firearms found inside the home or around Mr. Mason?
That's part of the investigation that's ongoing, so we're going to leave that at that. I think I've covered every question that I possibly can without getting into the investigation any deeper, but we will put out another press release this afternoon that will incorporate the names of the name of the trooper that was involved. I think the standard questions that were asked are always related to how long the trooper's been on, where his areas of responsibility have been, so we'll put that together, and I'll try to get it out before, I know there's some deadlines that vary amongst the media outlets, but we'll get that out later this afternoon as soon as we're sure that everything's all right on our end. And the autopsy results, I think, Major,
That's totally on New Hampshire's timetable.
Yeah.
So we may not have anything today. We have something later.
when we get that, we'll try to get that out to the media so we can inform the public as well. But I appreciate everybody coming here today to save everybody phone calls and things like that. And the patience shown, the questions were right on target. So thank you very much.